Hello and welcome to this talk about mastery learning approaches. My name is Jesse Whelan. I'm the founder and director of learning at Sandbox Learning, and this is the first of a four-part series about the different principles that we use at Sandbox Learning to help our students remember things and retain that information for longer. So the first part of the series here, we're going to talk about a mastery approach. Mastery approach is the opposite of what we normally do when we're learning something, particularly at school. In school, we are given a certain amount of time, a week or so, and we try to cram as much learning. And at the end of this, you may have learned 20%, 50%, 80, 100%, but regardless, you just have to move on. Mastery learning flips the script and says, actually, we're going to fix the level of achievement that we need, and then we're going to move on only when we're ready. Now, I've got a link there. Sal Khan of Khan Academy talks about this in a really great way, about the pitfalls of what happens if you just use a time-based approach. Imagine building a building where there are gaps that you leave every time you build a new level. Eventually, the whole building's going to come crumbling down like a big Jenga set because of all those gaps. So what we want to do is make sure that we're mastering the basics before we move on to more difficult things. Now, why do we do this? At Sandbox, everything we do is informed by the empirical research that's been done before. Now, in particular, mastery learning has been studied in 1984 by a researcher named Benjamin Bloom. And what he did is he tested out three different conditions. The first one, traditional, conventional classroom. Teacher up the front, students sitting there. They worked until a certain time schedule and then moved on. The second was the same classroom approach, but the teacher only moved on when the class demonstrated that they had mastered the content and were ready to move on. The third approach there is mastery-based tutoring. So one-on-one and also one to kind of 2 or 3, using that approach, but much smaller numbers of students for each tutor. When Benjamin Bloom then conducted follow-up tests with each of these groups, he found that the mastery-based approach far outperformed those of a traditional lecture. In fact, the mastery learning performed 1 standard deviation better, whereas the small group tutoring approach performed 2 standard deviations better. The implication of this is switching to a mastery approach will on average increase your scores by about a grade letter, right? And so that's what we do primarily at Sandbox. It's small group, primarily one-on-one. The important part is that we use a mastery-based approach. Doing it one-on-one doesn't actually provide that much value if all you're doing is a traditional lecture and just moving on just because after one class you need to move on. We are more effective because we only move on when the student's ready. Might take 10 minutes, might take 4 lessons, but you move on based on the pace of each student. So what does that mean for you if you're trying to incorporate a mastery approach in your learning? Well, first of all, you need to have a benchmark. You don't know whether you're ready to move on unless you understand where you are today. So that might be if you've got a textbook, doing questions in the textbook or the chapter review. It might be if it's English or humanities, doing an essay, having a conversation with someone, anything that actually demonstrates how you are going. The second point there, which is related, is when it comes to learning, you don't just want to trust your gut. It doesn't matter whether you think you are ready to move on. You need to be more objective. Do a little test, figure it out. The third part is you want to set achievement-based goals. Now, this is where we all kind of fall down. You really don't want to say, I'm going to spend an hour on this, I'm going to spend 3 hours, I'm going to spend a week, right? You say, I'm going to move on when I can get 50% in this little test, 80%, 90%. Where the bar is, that's up to you, but you want to work until you can demonstrate that you've achieved that. And the fourth one, that'll come up in an upcoming talk, but there's a really useful technique called the Pomodoro technique, which takes this and breaks down study into kind of little achievable building blocks to make you way more efficient. Well, that comes to the end of the talk. Stay tuned for our next one on retrieval practice.